Well, since it's also my mother church, the Dutch Reformed Church, I thought I would just briefly start by saying thank you to the congregation, but also to everybody who has come this morning. And thank you for the space for us to explore together some of the themes that Rian has referred to. I think the idea is that we'll have a conversation for about 30-40 minutes, and that we then want to open it up also to the floor for a couple of questions. And then after that, I think there's going to be an input from the Restitution Foundation. When we discussed beforehand how we're going to start this conversation, Lukhanyo said, no, you should start because you're the older guy. I was touched by that because it's the kind of respect, again, that transcends so many boundaries between us. But I had a strong sense that if we're having a conversation about restitution and a shared future, that it's not appropriate for a white Afrikaner male in his 50s to start, but that we need to get a sense of the context and the reason why people, especially people like me, have to take restitution so seriously. And so Lukhanyo has offered to start the conversation by giving us a sense of why this is such an urgent and embodied challenge.
Good morning, everybody. It really is such a great pleasure to see all of you here and see all of these beautiful faces. Let me just start off, obviously, by thanking Dominic Rian for a wonderful sermon. And I just want to thank you for honoring my family in the manner in which you have. It really means a lot to us. I think the symbolism to have my great-grandfather's sermon read, like at least a portion of it, delivered in the NG Kerk. It just means so much, so thank you very much. Thank you also to Wilhelm for this opportunity and for allowing me to kind of set the context as to why it is so important for us to journey together on this path of restitution. So I recently wrote a book. My wife and I, Abigail, who's sitting over there, we wrote a book called My Father Died for This. The book tells my family story, particularly the story of my father, who was a young man with a family. My mother is over there in Nomonde, with 2 kids, myself and my older sister Dorothy. And in 1985, my mother fell pregnant in that year. And my father was part of the leadership collective of an organization, a residents association in Cradock. And this organization called the Cradock Residents Association had a subsidiary called the Cradock Youth Association. And what they had managed to do between the years of 1983, 1984, and 1985, they had successfully managed to lead a revolution against the apartheid state in the community of Ulingelihle. And I think understanding the apartheid government and the whole notion as to why apartheid was set up was for a group of South Africans who are a minority in our country, had set up this social construct to engineer our society in a manner that privileged white South Africans at the expense of us black South Africans. So my father and his organization, led by a gentleman called Matthew Goniwe, who was the first president of the Craddock Residents Association, they rebelled against the system and were successful. By January 1985, they were successful in preventing the apartheid state to govern and to make decisions for us in our township of Lingelihle. Now, obviously, they were then seen by the apartheid government as being enemies or being terrorists. So, from around late 1984, the apartheid government then set processes in motion for them to be murdered, for them to be killed. I think the impetus was then greatly enhanced when the Craddock Residents Association managed to liberate Craddock, or to liberate Lingelihle. Because from January 1985 onwards, the people, my father and his comrades, were governing our township. One of the first things that they did was, when the people took over power, was to set up night schools and classes. So to have the children and the youth in Lingelihle who had been on a school boycott for 15 months, to get those children back to standard, in essence, so that they can try and catch up. They set up crashes in the township, which is something that we didn't have. A simple crash to send your child to, we didn't have in our township. So they set up an advice office. They were obviously trying to govern in a manner that was fit and dignified for us who lived in that township. Somehow, this did not sit very well with the apartheid government. So, in June 1985, my father, Fort Calata, and his comrades, Matthew Goniwe, Sparo Mkhonto, and Sicelo Mhlauli, drove to a meeting of the United Democratic Front in Port Elizabeth. And they never came back. They left on June the 27th, 1985. It was a Thursday morning when they left, and they never came back. "33 years after their murders, we still sit here today in a democratic South Africa, and we still do not know what had actually happened. We still do not know the truth around what had happened on the night that they were killed. We know that they were killed. We know that they were killed in the most brutal desecration that any human being should ever experienced. On the night that my father was killed, he was wearing my mother's ring. My mom was pregnant at the time, so because of water retention, her fingers had swollen up, so she had taken off her ring and she had put it on my father's hand. And I think the people that killed him, in a bid to try and hide his identity, they needed to take off all kinds of markers, anything that could be traced back to who this person was. I think those people that killed him must have struggled so badly to take off the ring of his finger that they then decided that they're just going to cut off the finger to get to the ring. Inside the ring was my family's name was engraved inside the ring. Inside the ring it said Calata. It's been 33 years since my father was murdered. We still have no accurate account as to how he was murdered. There still has not been a single person that has been charged for my father's murder. We doubt that there'll ever be a single person that will go to jail for my father's murder. But the worst of all is that for the last 33 years, there is a white South African that is walking around this country of ours with my mother's ring. Why he still holds on to that ring, what that ring reminds him of, it bothers me. And I've been trying to understand it for years, and I don't think I will ever be able to do so. But that is a little bit about my history and how a system, an apartheid system, had affected me and my family. I got affected by apartheid in the manner in which I did, simply because of the color of my skin. Something that I didn't have a choice in it. The level of education, just basic education that I received, was determined by the color of my skin. Just because I'm black, I had to receive this kind of education. An education that was meant to make me less of a being than Wilhelm, who's sitting here. Yet when we scratch just a little bit beyond the skin, there's really no difference between me and you, Wilhelm. There's no difference between black people and white people. My sister, my younger sister, was born about 19 days after my father's funeral. I can't even begin to imagine what Tumani's life is like, what she must make of life, what she must think of white people. She was born into this world without a father because someone decided that her father was a threat, was an enemy, was a terrorist, and therefore he deserved to be killed. That is our history. And that is a little bit of my story and my family's story.
Thank you, Lukhanyo. When I hear that kind of experience, which obviously you've just given us a small taste, And when I think back to the time I served in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a researcher, and the many people who came forward and shared some of that experience, including your mother. And I'm trying to think of what is an image that actually for me captures some of the depths of what has happened here, not just at the individual level, but at the systemic level. And I remember experience I had during the time of the TRC. I went to a reconciliation service in St. George's Cathedral in 1997. And at the end of the service, the canon called me to the side and said, "I want to show you something." And we walked down the corridor, and against one of the walls was a big painting. And I looked at this painting, and part of me sort of recoiled, partly because the figure on the cross, it was a painting of the crucifixion scene. And the figure on the cross was a black person. And to my Dutch Reformed Church eyes, my white Afrikaner nationalist Dutch Reformed eyes, it was the first time I actually was confronted with that image of a black person. And in this case, it was Chief Albert Luthuli. And then I looked down, and there was another figure in that painting. And something in the face looked familiar. The centurion standing there with the spear in the side of Christ, in this case, embodied by Chief Luthuli. And I looked closer, and I realized that face is my grandfather's face. And something in me obviously wanted to hide from that image, even though I've been on a journey at that point to try and face up to what apartheid was about. And in the last few years, when I was writing this book, aimed mostly at the Afrikaner community, but hoping that it would reach other people too, I started to sit with that image again and spend a lot of time with that, because in a nutshell, there's something about that image that speaks to me about the depths of that inhumanity that you've just pointed to. The idea that not only my grandfather as an individual, H.F. Verwoerd, who was at that time Prime Minister, but that in some sense he's holding this spear, and he's a representation, he's a representative of my community and my family and my church. And Chief Luthuli on the cross is a representative of the black community, the people of color, your family. So in some sense, your father is on that cross too, your mother, you. Every person I meet who has been on the receiving end of apartheid, in some sense, is also on that cross. And it seems to me that my challenge, and it's a challenge that I find has many layers, is to actually accept the fact that I am a grandson of H.F. Verwoerd. That his genes is in me. A quarter of my genes come from him. I cannot distance myself from him as a member of my family. I have to accept my embodiment as a white South African that he is representing in that image. And we, especially sitting in this building and sitting in this church, and Rian sort of alluded to it, but that this church that I grew up in was part of the system that made that happen. And we used the gospel to actually say the opposite. Because of what happened at the time when that painting was made in the early 60s, it was immediately declared as blasphemy by the Dutch Reformed Church. And the painter, Ron Harrison, was prosecuted and tortured brutally by the security police to get hold of this painting, and it was smuggled out of the country and only came back in the late 90s. So in some sense, that's been the journey that I've been on in the last few years, to revisit that and actually come to terms again with the fact that apartheid was not only a system, a political system. There's a depth of moral and spiritual wounding that took place that I think can be symbolized by the crucifixion. And that's something that I feel I will never fully be able to understand, but that is, I think, for me, the challenge. And what makes it a bit more complicated, and I think that's where the title Bloedbande, or bonds of blood ties, come from. That in some sense we are tied by a bond of blood, because your community's blood, your family's blood is also on my hands. So we are tied as South Africans of different backgrounds. But what makes it more difficult, I think, for people in my community and in my family to accept the blood on our hands is that we're also tied by blood to our families and to our communities. So just around this corner, my grandfather was assassinated in Parliament in 1966. And I know that in my family, and in my father especially, that they still feel the sense of indebtedness to my grandfather for giving his life in the service of the nation. So it's almost like his death has become a sacrifice. It's been sacralized. And it was within the Dutch Reformed Church, that's how people interpreted this. So how dare I be critical of him and of that system if he gave his life in the service of the nation? And that's a bond of blood that I think is almost like a covenantal thing in the Christian tradition, but it was used to form this boundary, this wall of blood almost around us that blinded us to what we were inflicting on people like yourself and your community. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is really trying to say, okay, this is who I am. I mean, I have a picture also of sitting on my grandfather's knees, literally as a baby, literally a picture of sitting on his lap, and he's feeding me a bottle of milk. So how do I accept the truth of that image, and I accept the truth of the crucifixion of the Black Christ of your family? That means I think I have to find a way to transform that bond of blood and actually say we need to find a way to work together to accept responsibility and to heal some of these deep wounds. So that's in a sense where I'm trying to come from in this story.
I appreciate that a lot, particularly your references to blood ties. I think as a Christian, and I think all of us here all believe in the same Christ, that we have a blood covenant with our Lord and Savior. And the covenant that I have with Christ is so that I can have freedom within His Father's home, like in heaven, with the Lord Himself. But I also feel that I have a blood covenant with the South African democracy, with this freedom, because my father's blood was spilled for this freedom. So I have a covenant with my Lord for the afterlife, but I also have a covenant with today. And I understand, or what I'm trying to, is how do I then make sure that I live my life in such a way as to honor both my upwards relationship with my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, but I also honor the fact that my father's life was not in vain and that he was not killed in vain. And I suppose that's why you and I are here, for us to be able to discuss a way forward as to how do we, who come from very, very different backgrounds, how do we get together the kinds of conversations that we need to have to make sure that we then build a South Africa, a future. I'm a father, you've met my son, he's 5 years old. I don't want Kwezi to grow up in a South Africa where he's judged by the color of his skin. He's not judged by people like me. He's not judged by other black people for the color of his skin. He's judged by white people. So how do we build? How do we talk? How do we create a shared future for ourselves? A future where my son can grow up with as much opportunity to realize his God-given potential as any white child. How do we create the kind of South Africa, the kind of future for all of us, where inequality, where poverty, where those social ills that we continue to carry as a remnant of apartheid, how do we create the kind of society where those ills are stopped in its tracks?
Thank you, Lukhanyo. I mean, I think for me, what has become more and more clear, and I'm thinking of, my son is here as well, and I'm thinking of the younger generation of people struggling with the legacy of apartheid, is that many of, especially people from, I suppose, the community that I'm from, just using that as a beginning point, that we don't have a deep historical awareness. That we actually struggle. I mean, Rian mentioned the slave lodge next door. You know, if you start, apartheid, and you go back, and I'm thinking how in my young age, how the Anglo-Boer War or the South African War, how that was used to form and shape my historical awareness to be a very narrow, ethnic, tribalistic historical awareness. So how do we get a sense of these deep roots of where we come from and where our problems come from, without making it into, again, a narrow ethnic kind of remembrance, especially for people from my background? And one of the things that struck me in your book and in the story that you tell, and we heard a little bit about it this morning again, and I was so grateful for that, was the important role that your great-grandfather played in your family's story, including your father's story. And I'm just thinking, when I was reading that, and I was beginning to get a sense of the kind of person he was, the kind of person that Luthuli was, the kind of person, many of the black South Africans that have helped me on my journey to wake up and to become alive as a human being. Then I'm just wondering, how can we create spaces to celebrate, especially for people from my community's background, to find the real stories of people in our history who really can inspire us to become family in a real way, not in a kind of romanticized Ubuntu way, but in a real way. And I was wondering just if you want to say something about that part of the story.
You and I have mentioned this a few times, that imagine if my great-grandfather had an opportunity to sit down like this with your grandfather, and where we would be today in terms of us as a society, in terms of the racial dynamics of the kind of society that we live. My great-grandfather, Canon James Arthur Calata, was an incredible person. I write a little bit about him in the book. And the more I write about him and the more I find out about him, the more I am completely in awe at how this one person could do so much in terms, just in one lifetime. There are schools on about 9 farms that surround Cradock that he established in the 1940s and 1950s. That are some of them that are still active today. He did all of that despite the harsh realities of apartheid. He was quite an important person in the church. In 1943, I think he was nominated to become a bishop in the Anglican Church, but because he was black, white clergy could not accept the fact that they would have a black bishop among them. So he was then denied the opportunity to become an Anglican bishop. So almost as a consolation prize, he was then canonized in the Anglican Church. At the same time, he was a politician, an activist. So much so that he held office within the African National Congress, which is the ANC. And he was the Secretary General of the ANC for a very long time, from 1936 to 1949. Walter Sisulu eventually replaced him as Secretary General of the ANC in 1949, a year after Daniel Malan had become the first president of essentially apartheid, a year after the National Party had won. Now, I'm not sure if Daniel Malan was inaugurated or whether he was sworn in this church. I don't know, but I'm sure as president or prime minister then, right across parliament. But my great-grandfather was that kind of person. He really was, and he's the man that actually raised my father. He raised my father as his own child. So my father was raised by this incredible person who really, really believed in the youth. He believed in how our young people actually hold the future. And he really just was an incredible person, and I think the kind of man that my father turned out to be was largely because of the man that raised him, which was the canon.
Thanks for sharing a little bit about that. I mean, in terms of your earlier comments, I think for me this is one of the key parts of the restitution journey in terms of the future, is to actually, for people like myself, to go through a process of re-education and rediscovering our history in a way that actually is very liberating, without romanticizing individuals and making anybody a saint. But there's a richness of a history here that I think many people from my backgrounds have missed out on, and it inspires me to be part of that movement.
Sorry, Wilhelm, but it's an opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's an opportunity for us to really get to learn about one another.
Yeah.
Learn about each other, not in the terms of what we were told about one another, about the differences about one another, but actually get to learn about one another in a real humane manner. For me, one of the things reading your book was to be confronted with this idea of your grandfather being an actual person, an actual human being, who, despite the atrocities that I grew up hearing, that a system that he was an architect of, despite all of that, he was a normal human being who would take naps in the afternoon, who had a wife that he loved and that loved him, that was to take walks on the beach. It's okay, never mind the fact that the beach was restricted for just white people, but he used to take walks on the beach. So now, how do we, as South Africans, how do we move forward? I'm not sure, judging by looking at the clock, if we should try and open this conversation up to questions, but I think there's so much that you and I can obviously discuss, but I think what I'd like to walk away with from this time is talking about the things that we need to do together to build a better South Africa. You as obviously representing the family which you do, the community in which you do, and how we can build bridges so that we can all live and raise our children in a South Africa for all.
Yes, I'm conscious of time too. I just want to finish perhaps with one point, because the family image that has been used since Friday and that we used again today, I was very glad that you referred to brothers and sisters, because the shadow side of the family image is of course also the father-son, the paternalistic temptation. And I think the church that I'm from, and this church in particular, but also the community that I'm from, comes with a kind of self-perception of missionary work, caring about black South Africans, but in a paternalistic or in a maternalistic way. Even sometimes people talk about the people working in their homes as we are like family, almost like family. And it seems to me one of the big things we need to do is to have relationships that are more equal. And I think that was the important thing about restitution for me, is that it stresses the need for us to move beyond charity, beyond paternalistic care for people who are poor and that we need to help, and all of that stuff that we sometimes, especially in Christian circles, emphasize, and get to the point where, especially as white Afrikaners, we need to be willing to sit down on an equal basis and listen and learn from your experiences. And it seems to me, unless we create those spaces for relationships of equality and humility, from my point of view, where we listen and learn, unless we create those spaces, the restitutional actions can very quickly go back into charity or pity or paternalistic family relationships. So there's a lot of work I feel we need to do to cultivate real, equal, and from my point of view, humble relationships when it comes to restitution.
I think your understanding of it is something that I appreciate, because and I can't speak on behalf of black people. Honestly I can't. I can only speak on behalf of me and possibly my family. For us, what is important is the acknowledgement. Is the acknowledgement that a wrong was perpetrated. For me and my family, it's the acknowledgement, firstly, that yes, my father, my mother's husband, my sister's father, he was killed. He was taken from us when he should not have been. We wanted to be acknowledged in a manner that yes, a wrong was perpetrated. But also, and I think while we have forgiven the actual perpetrators, what we would like to see is for the law to be carried forth. We would like to see the persons responsible for the deaths of my father and his comrades to be prosecuted, to stand in court of law, and for them to be tried for the murder of my father, because he died, he was killed. And I think that is a form of acknowledgement that we want to see, in that yes, he was not a terrorist, he was not the enemy, he was the father of a young boy, the father of a young girl. He was the father of a little girl that was still being formed in the womb when he was killed. He was the husband to a young woman who was 26 years old at the time. We want that kind of acknowledgement. And we also want acknowledgement that says that apartheid was wrong, that apartheid was a crime against humanity, and that the criminals that were responsible for apartheid must be held to account. Because we are sitting with a pain of massive atrocities that were committed against us, crimes against humanity that were committed against us, but there are no criminals that have been responsible, that have been held responsible for those crimes. If we are talking about how do we go forward and building a society, let's build it. Let's build it, and let's be genuine, and let's be real about it. We did not oppress ourselves. Yet, and we know that the Afrikaner community gained materially from apartheid. The Afrikaner community were able to build themselves up into owning a large percentage, over 97% of our economy. Today, we are told as black people that, yeah, but you govern. You must pull yourself out of this hole that we put you in. How can we pull ourselves out of this hole that we are in, even though we have been governing this country? That's another conversation. Even though we've been governing this country for this time for the past 25 years, how can we pull ourselves up? We'd be told to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, but we don't have boots. And this is why this conversation of restitution is important. This is why I appreciated so much what the Reverend was saying about us being able to be creative and us being able to make sacrifices, because the sacrifices that are needed are to help black children. And we need those sacrifices. We need to make those sacrifices both as blacks and as white people.
Thank you. I think, if we think about, in a sense, I've stressed the relational side of it, kind of the inner change that's needed in terms of changing that paradigm. But what you are emphasizing, and I just want to acknowledge that and agree with you, that we need to get beyond the change of attitudes and relationships to actually look for the more practical, visible ways to give something back, to be creative in that. And I am very troubled how in the white community that I often mix with, and I think it's Afrikaans and English, perhaps even more in the English community, I don't know, but that we find it difficult to accept the need for that kind of very tangible, practical, sacrificial sharing of our benefits and our privileges. And I just hope that more people can have the opportunity of relationships that matter. And because we're in relationship, it matters to start to address those very practical things together. It's not from a distance. It's not about writing a check. It's relational, and it's got to be with courage and commitment over a long period of time. And that's what I'm looking for. And ultimately, and this is the tragedy. When I think of my grandfather, and I think of members of my family who are still holding on to this fearful, almost like apartheid mindset, we heard about it this morning again, that in the process, we're also losing our own humanity. And this is the tragedy, that actually in restitution, there's also, and in relationship, there is a deep liberation that comes. That it ultimately is a paradoxical good news. It's not some kind of a burden you have to carry in a kind of masochistic way. And if we can find that creative energy, that the life-giving energy in the restitution journey for the sake of the future and for the sake of ourselves, I think then that is perhaps easier than to draw people into the process.
Think of what the consequences are if we leave this conversation here this morning and it just being a conversation, it just being a theoretical. I understand, for instance, that the Afrikaner community is very afraid of the young, militant voice that is coming through in South Africa at this moment. It is a voice of a generation that is slightly younger than me, the Must Fall movement. And I also, once again, I don't want to speak on behalf of the younger generation, but just from conversations that I have had, is that they don't have the patience that we have. Because I can come and I can have this conversation with you. I am employed by the SABC. Okay, well, maybe till the end of this month, but I continue to be employed by the SABC. I have a home that I'm paying, I have a bond, I have a wife, we have a child. We've got a relatively privileged life. I mean, it's nothing compared to the privilege of white South Africans, but we have a privileged life. There's this younger generation that's coming through. The living circumstances for them are so much harder because they are perpetuated, of course, by the inefficiencies of the present day government, but they continue to suffer because of apartheid. The ANC has only been in governance for 24 years, which is about half the time of apartheid. Apartheid took 46 years. So for us to dismantle the damage and the harm that was caused by apartheid, it's going to take us a very long time. Yes, the inefficiencies of the ANC are not helping the situation, but the legacy of apartheid continues to perpetuate itself today. And it's that generation, the must-fall generation, whose patience is going to run out, and we can see it. It is running out. Now, if we are going to walk out of here with this idea of restitution still just being a mind thing and not a heart thing, and not a practical thing that it is that we do, we are going to find that the window of conversation is closing. And when the window closes, everybody loses. Everybody loses. We as black people will lose. The white communities will lose, I think, even more. But if we carry forward this message of restitution, and what is it that we can do in our private spaces, in our private capacities, I think we will stand a chance. There is a little bit of hope. For instance, and I'm sorry to have to do this, but what your grandfather said about education for us black people, a message that was continued by the church about the education for black people. Why teach a black child mathematics? Where are they going to use mathematics when they work in my garden? So the church, in my opinion, to try and distance itself from that legacy of apartheid, needs to invest practically, financially, in the education of a black child, because that is how we undo the legacy of apartheid.
If you can just come to the front, that we can also just show